There's something most people don't know about Madara Uchiha, and it starts long before he ever became a villain. Before he was a name whispered in fear across the ninja world, he was an idea in the mind of one man, Masashi Kishimoto, the creator of Naruto. When Kishimoto sat down to design the Uchiha clan, he didn't begin with a character. He began with a feeling. He wanted a bloodline whose power grew not through training or discipline, but through loss, through love, through grief. He called this concept the curse of hatred, the idea that an Uchiha becomes stronger the more deeply they suffer. And Madara was built to be the living embodiment of that curse. So from the very beginning, Madara wasn't just a strong shinobi. He was the blueprint. Everything about the Uchiha, their tragedy, their pride, their unique eyes, was shaped around him first, and the rest of the clan was written to echo that design. In a way, the entire Uchiha story is Madara's story, told again and again through different faces. But here's where it becomes surprising. Most people assume Madara always stood against the Hidden Leaf Village, that he was an outsider, an enemy from the start. The truth is almost the opposite. Madara Uchiha helped build Konoha. He founded it, side by side with his greatest rival, Hashirama Senju of the Senju clan. The two of them had spent their childhoods on opposite sides of an endless war, and yet they shared the same dream, a place where children wouldn't have to die on battlefields. So they laid down their weapons, joined their clans, and created the village together. Think about that for a moment. The very village that would one day fear the Uchiha, isolate them, and push them into the shadows, was co-founded by an Uchiha. That contradiction sits at the heart of the entire clan's tragedy. Madara didn't destroy the peace, he helped create it. And then he watched it curdle. Because Madara never fully trusted that peace. He believed the Uchiha would always be treated as second to the Senju, always watched, always doubted. And when he couldn't convince the others to see the danger he saw, he made a choice that would define the rest of the story. He left. He walked away from the village he had built, and not long after, the world believed he had died in battle against Hashirama. But he hadn't. And this is where the design of his character becomes something rare. Madara had secretly kept himself alive, clinging to life for decades, hidden away, quietly setting in motion a plan so long and so patient that it would span generations. He became one of the longest-running hidden villains in the entire series, a man presumed dead, working from the shadows, his influence reaching characters who had never even seen his face. For years, readers didn't know how much of the story was quietly being shaped by someone the world had already buried. And now, but what's really surprising comes next. Let's talk about his eyes. The Sharingan is the trademark of the Uchiha, but its most powerful form, the Mangekyo Sharingan, is different for every single person who awakens it. In the lore, that unique shape isn't decoration, it's meant to reflect the personal trauma that unlocked it. Each pattern is tied to a specific loss, a specific moment of pain. So when Kishimoto designed Madara's Mangekyo, he deliberately made it look unlike any other in the series. He didn't want it to resemble Itachi's or Sasuke's or Kakashi's. He wanted it instantly recognizable as Madara's alone, a visual fingerprint of one man's grief. That careful attention to detail is part of why the Uchiha eyes became one of the most iconic designs in all of anime. So by this point in the story, everything seems to be building toward one conclusion: the ancient founder, the immortal schemer, the unique, terrifying eyes. Fans naturally assumed Madara Uchiha was the final villain of Naruto, the last obstacle, the ultimate threat. He had earned that place through decades of build-up. But the story had one more twist, and it's a deeply ironic one. Madara, the master manipulator who spent a lifetime pulling strings from the shadows,
was himself being manipulated the entire time. At the height of his power, he is betrayed and hijacked by a creature called Black Zetsu, an entity that had been quietly steering events for far longer than even Madara had.
In a single moment, the great Uchiha, the man who thought he controlled everything, is revealed to be just another pawn in someone else's much older scheme. It's a fitting end for a character built on the curse of hatred. Madara believed his suffering made him strong enough to reshape the world. Instead, that same hatred made him easy to use, a tool for a plan he never truly understood. The founder of the clan's darkness became a victim of it. And that is the strange, layered truth of Madara Uchiha. Not simply a villain, but the original design that the entire Uchiha clan was built around. A man who created a village, faked his own death, and in the end was outplayed by the very darkness he embodied. What very few people realize is that Itachi Uchiha, the character so many fans remember as the coldest antagonist in the entire series, was almost the complete opposite of what he first appeared to be. When Masashi Kishimoto introduced him, the setup was deliberately brutal. Here was a man who, in a single night, murdered his entire clan. Every aunt, every uncle, every cousin, his own mother and father, and then walked away without a trace of remorse on his face. He was framed from the very beginning as one of the most feared figures in the story, a shadow hanging over young Sasuke, a name spoken with dread. And that was intentional. Kishimoto wanted the audience to hate him first, so that the truth, when it finally arrived, would land as hard as possible. Because the truth, revealed slowly over many years of story, is that Itachi was never a villain at all. He was a loyal operative of the Hidden Leaf Village. The Uchiha clan, feeling pushed to the margins of Konoha society, had begun planning a coup, a rebellion that would almost certainly have plunged the village, and possibly the wider ninja world, into another devastating war. And so the leadership of Konoha made an impossible decision. Rather than allow that war to happen, they ordered Itachi, a teenager still barely more than a child, to eliminate his own clan before the coup could begin. He was not a monster who destroyed his family for power. He was a protector who sacrificed everything, including his own name and reputation, to keep the peace. But here is the detail that makes the whole design so heartbreaking. When Itachi carried out that mission, he could not bring himself to kill everyone. He spared exactly one person, his little brother, Sasuke. And because he had chosen to carry the burden of being remembered as a villain, he could not simply explain the truth. So instead, he did something almost unthinkable. He decided to play the role of the monster for the rest of his life, deliberately making Sasuke hate him, deliberately giving his brother a reason to grow stronger, so that one day, Sasuke would become powerful enough to hunt him down and kill him. Itachi wanted to die by his brother's hand. He engineered his own defeat years in advance, as a final act of love disguised as cruelty. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because that hidden double life is exactly why Itachi became one of Kishimoto's personal favorite characters to write. In interviews, Kishimoto has said that Itachi was among the most rewarding figures he created, precisely because of the tragic contradiction living inside him. On the surface, Itachi is calm, quiet, almost serene. He rarely raises his voice. He moves through every scene with a stillness that reads, at first, as coldness. But underneath that calm exterior is a person carrying an unimaginable weight. The grief of having killed his own family, the loneliness of being hated by the one person he loved most, and the certainty that he would die misunderstood. Writing a character whose outward peace conceals that much pain gave Kishimoto a kind of depth that few other characters in the series could offer. That contradiction even shaped the way many fans read Itachi's design. If you look closely at his face, you'll notice two long lines running down from beneath his eyes, sometimes mistaken for wrinkles or simply an aging effect. Many readers like to interpret those lines as a quiet hint at the constant grief he carries, the sense of a man who has been weeping on the inside for years. And some connect them to his powers too. Itachi wielded the Mangekyo Sharingan, one of the most powerful eye techniques in the entire world of Naruto. But that power came with a devastating cost. Every time he used it, it damaged his eyes a little more. Overuse of the Mangekyo slowly, permanently causes blindness. The light literally fades from the user's vision the more they rely on it. So some fans even read those lines beneath his eyes as a subtle echo of the physical toll his abilities were taking, the price of the very strength that made him feared. Put all of this together, and you begin to understand why Itachi resonated with so many people once his story was fully told. He was designed as a villain, revealed as a hero, and written as a tragedy. He spent his entire short life being hated for a choice that saved thousands, protecting a brother who would spend years dreaming of killing him, and slowly going blind from the power he used to keep the illusion alive. Kishimoto built him as a deliberate misdirection, a character whose first impression is a lie, and whose true nature only makes sense in reverse, once you know everything he was hiding. It's a rare kind of storytelling, where the more you learn, the more your feelings about a character completely invert. And it's the reason that, of all the members of the Uchiha bloodline, Itachi remains the one whose quiet sacrifice lingers longest in the mind. The story of Sasuke Uchiha begins, curiously, not with him at all, but with a single act of violence he never saw coming. He was a small boy, ordinary in the ways that matter, when he walked home one evening to find every member of his clan already dead. In a single night, the entire Uchiha bloodline was erased, and Sasuke became something the story never intended to have more than one of: the last loyal survivor of the massacre. That word, loyal, is the detail worth holding on to, because it separates him from everyone else who shared his name. Now, here is a small piece of behind-the-scenes record that most viewers never learn. When Masashi Kishimoto first sketched the shape of his manga, he built Sasuke as a deliberate archetype, the rival, the mirror. Naruto was designed to be loud, clumsy, and struggling, a boy who failed his graduation exam 3 separate times before passing. So Kishimoto needed a counterweight, and he made Sasuke cool, gifted, and effortless, the top-ranked student of their academy class. The contrast wasn't accidental. It was engineering. Every strength Naruto lacked, Sasuke was given, precisely so the two could pull against each other for the length of the story. But that gift came with a cost, and the cost was written into his blood. The Uchiha carry what the series calls the curse of hatred, and its mechanics are stranger than they first appear. For the Uchiha, love and loss are not opposites. They are fuel. The more deeply an Uchiha loves, and the more that love is taken from them, the more their Sharingan matures and their hatred deepens. So Sasuke's entire arc becomes a kind of tragic equation. Every person he cares for and loses pushes his eyes further along their evolution, and pushes him further down the road toward revenge. The very thing that makes him powerful is the thing that isolates him. His strength and his loneliness grow from the same root. And so, for years of story time, Sasuke has exactly one purpose. He intends to hunt down and kill the man who slaughtered his family, his own older brother, Itachi. This is the tension the entire series hangs on, and it feels, for a long while, completely justified. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come. Because when Sasuke finally corners Itachi, and finally wins, the ground shifts beneath everything he believed. The brother he spent his whole life hating turns out to have loved him more than anyone. Itachi had killed the clan under orders to prevent a civil war that would have cost far more lives, and he had spared exactly one person, Sasuke. Everything after that, the cruelty, the coldness, the pretense of being a villain, was a performance designed to make Sasuke strong enough to survive, and to give him a target worth becoming strong for. Itachi even engineered his own death so that his little brother could be the one to defeat him. The person Sasuke wanted most to kill had, quietly, sacrificed everything for him. That single revelation doesn't just complicate his worldview, it shatters it. Here is where a curious footnote in the story's development becomes relevant. Kishimoto has said in interviews that he originally intended Sasuke to remain a villain for much longer, perhaps even to the very end. But as he wrote, the story pulled in a different direction, toward reconciliation rather than ruin. And that shift reflected something Kishimoto genuinely believed, that the Uchiha cycle of hatred, this centuries-old inheritance of love turning to vengeance, could finally be broken. Sasuke was meant to be the proof, not because he was weak enough to forgive, but because he was strong enough to stop. But the strangest record attached to Sasuke isn't about his heart. It's about his eyes. Across the entire history of the Uchiha, one power was supposed to be forever beyond their reach: the Rinnegan. It's the rarest and most legendary eye in the world, associated not with any ordinary clan, but with the Sage of Six Paths, the mythical figure said to have founded the very concept of ninja arts. Uchiha awaken the Sharingan. A rare few awaken the Mangekyo above it. But the Rinnegan sits higher still, and it belonged to a bloodline older than the Uchiha itself. So when Sasuke awakens the Rinnegan, it does something no other Uchiha in the series achieves in the same way. It quietly rewrites his ancestry. It hints that his bloodline traces back, past the clan, past the massacre, all the way to the Sage of Six Paths himself, to the origin point of nearly every power in the story. The last loyal Uchiha turns out to carry the oldest inheritance of all. And what makes it fitting is the symmetry. Naruto inherits the will of one of the sage's sons. Sasuke inherits the will of the other. Two boys, designed as opposites, revealed at last to be two halves of the same ancient lineage. It's the kind of detail the series buries beneath years of conflict, only to let it surface at the very end, when the rivalry finally resolves. The loudest boy and the last survivor, standing not against each other, but beside each other. Behind the familiar appearance of Shisui Uchiha lies one of the most quietly important figures in the entire story. A shinobi whose influence stretches far beyond the handful of moments he actually spends on screen. Most people who follow the clan remember him as a name, a whisper attached to a legend. But the reality of who he was and what he tried to do runs against almost everything you'd expect from an Uchiha. Start with the reputation. Within the clan, Shisui was known as Shisui of the Body Flicker, a title earned through a speed so refined it looked like teleportation. He seemed to appear and vanish in the same breath, closing distances that should have taken seconds, arriving before an opponent even registered that he'd moved. The body flicker technique itself is a common tool among shinobi, a quick burst of movement. But Shisui mastered it to a degree so extreme that his own comrades attached his name to it. That alone would have made him remarkable. Yet the speed was almost the least interesting thing about him, because his true weapon lived in his eyes. When Shisui awakened the Mangekyo Sharingan, it granted him a genjutsu called Koto Amatsukami. And this is where the story turns strange. Koto Amatsukami is arguably the single most powerful genjutsu in the entire series. It could enter a person's mind and reshape their choices, guiding them toward actions they believed were entirely their own. There was no struggle, no visible break, no moment where the victim sensed something wrong. They simply did what Shisui wanted and walked away convinced the decision had come from within. A power like that, in the hands of most shinobi in this world, would have been a nightmare. It's the kind of ability built for domination. And here's where the expectation collapses. You'd assume a man carrying the ultimate mind control technique, born into a clan haunted by what they called the curse of hatred, would use it to seize power, to strike first, to win. Shisui intended the opposite. As tension built between the Uchiha and the village that surrounded them, as the clan crept toward a coup that threatened to burn everything down, Shisui made a quiet decision. He would use Koto Amatsukami not to conquer, but to prevent a war. He planned to influence the clan's leadership, to steer them away from rebellion, to stop the uprising without a single life being lost. The most dangerous genjutsu ever shown, aimed at achieving peace. It's a detail that flips the entire idea of what an Uchiha was supposed to be. Proof that not every member of that bloodline followed the path of hatred laid out for them. But here's what almost nobody knows. That plan never got the chance to unfold, and the reason it failed says as much about the village as it does about Shisui. His eye was so valuable, so uniquely powerful, that others wanted it for themselves. Danzo Shimura, a man who operated in the shadows of the leadership, stole one of Shisui's eyes outright, taking the power for his own hidden agenda. In an instant, the peaceful solution was cut in half, both literally and figuratively. Shisui was left with one eye and a plan that could no longer be completed, hunted by the very forces he'd tried to protect everyone from. So he made a choice. And this is the moment that quietly reshapes the whole tragedy that follows. Knowing his remaining eye would be taken too, knowing what its power could mean in the wrong hands, Shisui gave it to the one person he trusted. He entrusted his last eye to Itachi, his closest friend, before his death. It was a final act of faith, a way of ensuring that even after he was gone, the strength of his gift would remain with someone who might still do good with it. And then Shisui removed himself from the equation entirely, sacrificing his own life so that his eye and his hope would survive him. Almost all of this happens off-screen, tucked into the backstory, revealed only in fragments long after the fact. And yet that sacrifice is the spark for everything. Shisui's death is what set Itachi on his path, pushing him toward the impossible decisions that would define the rest of the clan's story. Without Shisui, there is no version of Itachi that we recognize. The grief, the resolve, the willingness to carry an unbearable burden alone. All of it traces back to a friend who died trying to stop a war peacefully and failed. For a character with so little screen time, Shisui functions as a hidden linchpin, the quiet pivot around which the entire downfall turns. That's the counterintuitive truth of him, the fastest shinobi in the clan, the holder of the strongest genjutsu ever shown, and he chose to use none of it for himself. He wanted to save people who never even knew he was trying. And in the end, the man remembered mostly as a legend and a whisper turned out to be one of the few members of that cursed bloodline who genuinely lived and died for peace. If you look closely at Obito Uchiha, you find one of the clearest examples of how a small, almost forgettable detail can quietly grow into the emotional spine of an entire series. When he first appears, he isn't a mastermind or a villain. He's a kid, a clumsy, cheerful, chronically late teammate of young Kakashi, the kind of side character you meet in a single flashback and never expect to see again. He shows up, he stumbles through a mission, and he supposedly dies saving the people around him. In most stories, that would be the end of him. A sad little footnote meant to teach the main character a lesson and then disappear. But that's exactly where the lucky twist begins, because Masashi Kishimoto didn't let that footnote stay buried. Instead, years of story later, he reached back to that one throwaway death and revealed that it had never really ended at all. Obito survived. And not just survived, he became Tobi, the masked figure lurking behind so much of the conflict that drives the later arcs. The gentle, well-meaning boy who once dreamed of becoming Hokage had, somewhere along the way, turned into the quiet architect of a war. It's a reveal that works precisely because the setup looked so harmless. Nobody was supposed to suspect the klutz. So how does a kind boy become that? The answer is where the Uchiha's so-called curse of hatred stops being an abstract idea and becomes something painfully concrete. Obito's fall doesn't start with ambition or cruelty. It starts with love. He watches the girl he cares about, Rin, die right in front of him. And in that single moment, everything he believed about the world collapses. For the Uchiha, the legend goes that their emotions run so deep that loss doesn't just hurt them, it rewires them. Their capacity to love is the very thing that makes their despair so dangerous. Obito is the perfect dramatization of that idea, because it's not hatred that breaks him. It's affection turned inside out. But here's the part that quietly ties it all together. The accident that ripples through the whole series. Before any of that, before the mask and the war, there's a moment on that early mission where the boy who supposedly died gives something away. Crushed and dying, as everyone believed, Obito asks that his own Sharingan be transplanted into Kakashi. It's meant as a final gift between friends, a way to keep protecting the teammate he thought he was leaving behind. And it works. Kakashi carries that eye for years. So think about what that actually means. The famous copy ninja, one of the most respected characters in the entire story, spends the bulk of his life fighting with the eye of a friend he believed he had failed to save. Every technique he copies, every enemy he reads, he does it through Obito's gift, a constant, silent reminder worn on his own face. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Neither of them knows the truth. Kakashi believes he's honoring a dead friend, while that same friend is very much alive, watching from behind a mask, and eventually standing on the opposite side of a battlefield. Two people bound by the same eye, each carrying a version of the other that isn't real anymore. That's the kind of layering that only becomes possible because of a retroactive decision. Kishimoto essentially took a minor flashback and used it to reach backward through the timeline, deepening a character who had already been established for years. Kakashi's calm, his guilt, his habit of being late, traits fans had simply accepted, suddenly gained a source. The lateness wasn't just a quirk. It was tied to Obito, to a promise, to a grave he visited. A single early death, reinterpreted, turned into a decade-spanning emotional foundation that made an already popular character feel almost unbearably human. And here's the genuinely counterintuitive part, the thing that flips the usual expectation. We tend to assume that a story's most important characters are planned from the very beginning, carefully mapped out chapter by chapter. But Obito suggests the opposite can be true. Some of the most load-bearing pieces of a long series aren't grand blueprints. They're small seeds that a writer chooses, later, to water. The klutzy kid who died in a flashback wasn't obviously destined to matter. He became essential because the author decided, after the fact, that he should. The weight came from the return, not the setup. So in the end, Obito sits at the intersection of two opposite readings, and both are true at once. On one side, he's a tragedy, a loving boy hollowed out by grief, walking straight into the very curse his clan is famous for. On the other, he's a lucky accident of storytelling, the character whose reappearance quietly reshaped the meaning of everyone around him. His gift gave Kakashi his eye, his death gave Kakashi his sorrow, and his survival gave the whole story a second heartbeat it never planned to have. Proof that in a bloodline defined by hatred, even a single overlooked boy could change absolutely everything. People rarely talk about Kakashi Hatake as an Uchiha, and that's because he isn't one. Not by blood, not by name, not by birth. And yet, when you trace the story of the Uchiha clan, a family defined by their crimson eyes and the burden those eyes carry, you keep running into this one silver-haired outsider who somehow ended up carrying a piece of their legacy for most of his life. It's one of the strangest connections in the entire Naruto world. A boy born to the Hatake line, wielding a power that was never supposed to belong to him. To understand how that happened, you have to remember Obito. Because when Obito was crushed beneath that stone, believing himself to be dying, he asked their teammate to transplant his left Sharingan into Kakashi. It was a gift, a final act from a boy who admired the friend he thought he'd never see again. But that gift changed everything about who Kakashi would become. With that single borrowed eye, Kakashi began to copy jutsu. Not one, not a dozen, over 1,000 techniques, according to his reputation across the ninja world. He watched an opponent's hand seals, and the Sharingan let him replicate them almost instantly. So he earned a name that followed him for the rest of his career, Kakashi of the Sharingan. And here's the detail worth pausing on. In a series where the Sharingan is the sacred birthright of an entire clan, Kakashi is the only non-Uchiha ever to become famous for it. The only outsider whose name became bound to their dojutsu. But that fame came with a cost most people overlook. For an Uchiha, the Sharingan is natural. It's woven into their chakra, into their body, into the very way they're built. Kakashi had none of that. So the eye that gave the Uchiha their edge became, for him, a constant weight. It drained his chakra whenever it was open. He couldn't simply close it and rest. The transplant didn't work that way. He had to keep it covered beneath his headband just to conserve his strength. And this is the contradiction at the heart of his story. The very thing that made him legendary was also quietly wearing him down, every single day. That's what makes his role in the larger story so interesting. Kishimoto used Kakashi as a window. Through the Uchiha, we see the Sharingan as an inheritance, something earned through their own pain and awakened by their own emotions. But through Kakashi, we get to see it from the outside. We see what it costs someone who was never meant to hold it. And in doing that, the reader learns to appreciate what the Uchiha are actually born with, a power that flows naturally through them, while an outsider has to sacrifice just to keep it lit. But what's really surprising comes next. Because Kakashi's connection to the Uchiha didn't stay small or simple. Over the years, that borrowed eye grew into something far greater than a copying tool. Under the strain of loss and battle, Kakashi awakened the Mangekyo Sharingan, the advanced form that only appears after deep emotional trauma. And with it came Kamui, one of the most feared techniques in the entire war. a power that could warp space itself, tearing a target away into another dimension. For a boy with no Uchiha blood, that was almost unheard of. He had reached a stage of the dojutsu that many true Uchiha never touched. And yet, the eye was never truly his. It belonged to Obito. So on that final battlefield, the connection came full circle when Madara tore the Sharingan away, and Kakashi lost the eye he'd carried for most of his life. In that instant, the man known as Kakashi of the Sharingan was, for the first time in years, simply Kakashi again. Just a shinobi, without the power that had defined him. But the story wasn't finished with him. Near the end of the war, in his most desperate moment, Kakashi received something no Hatake had ever known. Through Obito's spirit and the strange currents of that final battle, he was briefly granted a complete Uchiha power, both Mangekyo eyes at once, and the ability to manifest a full Susanoo, the towering guardian of chakra that only the strongest Uchiha can summon. For a few short moments, a man with no Uchiha blood stood on the battlefield, wielding the clan's ultimate technique. It was temporary. It faded. But it happened. And that's the quiet marvel of Kakashi Hatake. He was never part of the clan, yet the clan runs through his entire life like a thread that refuses to be cut. He borrowed their eye, carried their name, suffered their burden, and reached heights within their power that few of their own ever managed. He is the unexpected bridge, the outsider who let the rest of us understand the Uchiha from the one perspective the Uchiha themselves could never offer. Not from the inside, looking out, but from the outside, looking in. Curiously enough, Sarada Uchiha exists as the answer to a question the clan spent its entire history asking without ever daring to hope for a reply. Because for most of the story, the Uchiha are defined by absence, by who was lost, who was killed, who walked away. The clan was reduced to two survivors, Sasuke and Itachi, and then, after everything, to just one. So when you trace the family line forward, you expect it to simply end. A name in a history book, a crest on an old gate. But instead, the line continues. And it continues through a child born not from tragedy, but from something the Uchiha had almost forgotten was possible. An ordinary, quiet love. Sarada is the daughter of Sasuke Uchiha and Sakura Haruno, and that parentage alone carries an enormous amount of weight. Her father is the last surviving heir of a clan nearly erased from existence, and her mother comes from outside that bloodline entirely. Someone with no dojutsu, no famous lineage, just persistence and warmth. So Sarada represents something the clan had never actually experienced before. A rebirth. Not a survivor clinging to the past, but a genuinely new beginning, built on the far side of the massacre that should have ended everything. And you might wonder whether the bloodline itself truly survived, whether the power that defined the Uchiha was passed on, or whether it faded with the last generation. That question gets answered directly. As a child, Sarada awakens her Sharingan, the crimson eye that marks every true Uchiha. It's a small moment, but the implication is enormous. The massacre killed the people, but it could not kill the bloodline. The eye returns, in a new set of hands, in a new generation. The Uchiha are, against all odds, still here. But here's where her story quietly diverges from everyone who came before her. For generations, the Sharingan awakened through loss, through grief, through hatred, through the death of someone loved. The eye was, in a sense, a monument to pain. The clan even had a name for the darkness that followed, the curse of hatred. The idea that an Uchiha's love, once broken, curdles into resentment powerful enough to consume them. Madara, Itachi, Sasuke, each of them wrestled with it. So the natural fear is that Sarada would inherit not just the eye, but the curse attached to it. Instead, she inherits a dream that turns the clan's entire history upside down. The Uchiha spent decades resenting the Hidden Leaf Village, feeling marginalized, distrusted, pushed to the edges of a society they helped build. That resentment is, arguably, what led to the massacre in the first place. So the logical expectation for a new Uchiha would be more of the same. More distance, more suspicion, maybe even more revenge. But Sarada wants none of that. Her dream is to become Hokage, to lead the very village her ancestors felt betrayed by. Think about how remarkable that reversal is. The clan that once plotted against the village now produces a daughter who wants to protect it from the highest seat of authority it has. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because that shift isn't just emotional, it's structural. The whole tragedy of the Uchiha was a cycle. Love turning to hatred, hatred turning to violence, violence turning to isolation, isolation feeding more hatred. Sarada breaks the loop not by being stronger than her ancestors, but simply by being raised differently. She grows up loved. She grows up wanted. She never experiences the foundational loss that twisted the people before her. So when the series asks its central question, can the curse of hatred actually be broken? Sarada's mere existence is the quiet answer. Not through a battle, not through a jutsu, through a childhood. There's also a small design detail that carries more meaning than it first appears. Masashi Kishimoto, the creator, chose to give Sarada glasses, which is a genuinely unusual choice for a Sharingan user, since the Sharingan is famous for granting extraordinary visual perception. On the surface, it seems almost contradictory. An eye known for perfect sight paired with corrective lenses. And many fans read the choice as a way to visually combine both of her parents, the cool, composed look of Sasuke with the softer warmth of Sakura. In that reading, the glasses became her way of belonging to both halves of that heritage at once, the clan and the outsider, the power and the tenderness. So when you step back and look at the full arc of the Uchiha, the founding, the rivalry with the Senju, the political marginalization, the massacre, the near extinction, the lone survivor searching for a reason to keep the name alive, it all funnels toward this one child who, almost casually, resolves it. She doesn't erase the clan's history. The tragedy still happened. The graves are still there. But she reframes what the Uchiha can become. Their legacy is no longer defined solely by what was lost, but by what was rebuilt from it. The clan, cursed by hatred, ends its story not with another act of vengeance, but with a young girl in glasses, red eyes awakened, quietly deciding that the future is worth protecting. Originally, Indra Otsutsuki was never meant to exist. When Kishimoto first began telling the story of the Uchiha, there was no ancient ancestor, no divine origin, no thousand-year feud written into the bloodline. The clan was simply a proud, tragic family caught in the cycle of war. Indra arrived late, a figure introduced near the very end of the series. And yet, once he appeared, he retroactively rewrote everything that had come before him. In a way, he is the story's most famous course correction, a piece added so late that it reshaped the entire meaning of the plot. The way a single line of code, patched in at the last moment, can change how an entire game is understood. To make sense of him, we have to go back to Hashirama Otsutsuki, the sage of six paths, the man who gave the world ninjutsu itself. Hashirama had two sons. Indra was the elder, and by every measure that mattered in that age, he was the extraordinary one. He was born gifted, blessed with immense power and a natural genius for combat that his younger brother simply did not possess. If you were choosing an heir by talent alone, there would be no contest.
Indra was the obvious answer. But Hagoromo did not choose by talent. And this is where the tension begins. When the sage grew old and had to decide which son would inherit his teachings and carry his vision forward, he looked past the gifted elder and chose Ashura, the younger, the ordinary one. The son who had to struggle for everything, who relied not on his own strength, but on the bonds he formed with others. To Hagoromo, that was the point. Power without love, he believed, would only lead to ruin. So the inheritance passed to the weaker brother, and the stronger one was left with nothing but the memory of being overlooked. That single decision is the seed of everything. Because Indra felt cheated. He had done everything right, been born with everything, and still it wasn't enough. His resentment didn't fade. It hardened into something that would outlive him entirely. This is the true origin of what the story calls the Uchiha's curse of hatred. It isn't a supernatural spell or a literal disease. It is, quite literally, one man's jealousy passed down as an emotional inheritance, generation after generation, for 1,000 years. Every Uchiha who ever burned with grief, every one who turned love into hatred and hatred into power, was in some sense reliving the moment their ancestor was passed over by his own father. And here is the detail that makes Indra so central to the clan's identity. His eyes, the Sharingan, were the very first of their kind. Not a copy, not a variation, but the prototype from which every Uchiha eye that followed descended. Which means the clan's signature power, the red eyes that would come to symbolize the entire bloodline, did not begin as a weapon of war. It began as the physical expression of a jealous older brother's pain. The Sharingan, at its root, is grief made visible. Now, yet the most unexpected part is still to come. Because for all his power, for all his resentment, Indra was never designed to stand alone. Kishimoto built him as a deliberate mirror of his brother Ashura, two halves of a single idea. Ashura became the ancestor of the Senju clan, the family of unity and cooperation. Indra became the ancestor of the Uchiha, the family of individual brilliance and isolation. And so the great feud between Uchiha and Senju, the rivalry that shaped the entire world of the story, that led to the founding of the villages and countless wars, turns out to be nothing more than an argument between two brothers, echoing across 1,000 years through the bodies of their descendants. Madara and Hashirama, Sasuke and Naruto. All of them, whether they knew it or not, were fighting the same quarrel their ancestors began at their father's side. That's the reincarnation cycle that Indra's late arrival made possible. By introducing him at the end, Kishimoto reframed his own story. Suddenly, the endless conflict wasn't just history repeating. It was the same two souls, reborn again and again, trying and failing to resolve a disagreement neither of them started. What looked like a war between clans became a family argument that simply refused to die. And this is why Indra matters so much despite appearing so briefly. He is the retroactive foundation of the entire Uchiha tragedy. Every act of vengeance, every awakened eye, every brother turned against brother traces back to him. Not because he cursed anyone, but because his hurt was never healed, only inherited. The counterintuitive truth is that the Uchiha's greatest gift and their deepest wound are the same thing. The talent that should have made Indra the chosen one instead made him the forgotten one, and that forgetting became the poison in the bloodline. So when we speak of a clan cursed by hatred, we are really speaking of one boy who was born with everything and still felt he had been given nothing at all. One often overlooked detail about Fugaku Uchiha is that he sat at the very center of the clan's story, and yet the series spends almost no time letting us know him.
He was the leader of the Uchiha, the head of the family, and the father of both Itachi and Sasuke. That single fact alone places him at the heart of the tragedy, because nearly everything that happens to those two brothers can be traced back to the choices this one quiet man was forced to make. Now, the interesting thing here is the reputation he carried. Fugaku was known by a nickname that sounds almost like something out of an old legend. Wicked Eye Fugaku. It's the kind of title you'd expect to belong to a villain or to some wandering swordsman in a samurai film. But he earned it for a very specific reason. During the Nine Tails attack on the village, his Mangekyo Sharingan was so feared that the name stuck to him. And that's a small but telling detail, because it hints at a level of power the story never fully shows us. We're simply told, almost in passing, that this man was dangerous enough to earn a title like that. So, you'd expect a man called Wicked Eye to be ruthless. But here's where the character quietly turns against your expectations. Fugaku was not a warlord hungry for battle. He was thoughtful, cautious, and, in the end, deeply reluctant. He tried to prevent the coup d'etat that his own clan was drifting toward. He held on to a hope that his son Itachi could act as a bridge, someone who could stand between the Uchiha and the village of Konoha and keep the peace. So, the man with the fearsome eye was, underneath it all, a father trying to stop a war before it started. To understand why that war was brewing at all, you have to look at where the Uchiha were living. Over the years, the clan had been quietly pushed to the edge of the village. They were given control of the police force, and on the surface, that sounds like an honor. Trusting your strongest clan with law and order seems reasonable. But that arrangement was never really about honor. It was a way to keep a powerful family isolated, watched, and slightly separate from everyone else. The Uchiha were being kept at arm's length, and they knew it. And that's the quiet cultural thread running underneath all of this. Because the police connection isn't just a plot device, it's a nod to real history. The symbol the Uchiha police force wears is based on the crest once used by Japan's Edo period magistrates, the officials who kept order in the old cities. So, when you see that emblem, you're looking at a small piece of real Japanese history folded into the story. A clan of watchmen, given a badge that echoes the law-keepers of centuries past, and yet trusted by no one above them. But here's what almost nobody knows. That very isolation is what turned suspicion into something far more dangerous. The mistrust the clan felt was real, and it slowly pushed Fugaku toward planning a rebellion. He wasn't a man who wanted power for its own sake, but he was cornered, and a cornered leader begins to consider the unthinkable. So the clan started to move toward an uprising. And that, in turn, is precisely why the village made its terrible decision. Konoha ordered the massacre of the Uchiha, not out of random cruelty, but out of fear. And this is the part worth sitting with for a moment, because it flips the whole story on its head. We often imagine the Uchiha were destroyed because they were weak, or because they were traitors who simply deserved it. But the truth is almost the opposite. The clan's downfall grew directly out of the fear their own strength inspired. They were too powerful to be trusted, and so their power became the very reason for their end. The thing that made them special is the thing that got them erased. Which brings us to Fugaku's final moments, and this is where the character quietly becomes something more than a clan leader. When the massacre came, it was his own son, Itachi, who carried it out. You would expect a father in that position to rage, or to plead, or to fight to the last. But Fugaku did none of those things. He knelt calmly and accepted death at his son's hands. And in those last seconds, he told Itachi that he was proud of him. That single line changes everything. It takes what could have been a simple story of betrayal and reframes it as a family tragedy. Fugaku understood the impossible weight his son was carrying, and instead of cursing him, he offered him a moment of peace. So the man called Wicked Eye, the leader who nearly started a rebellion, spent his final breath forgiving the very child who came to end his life. And that's why Fugaku lingers in the mind. He's a background figure who turns out to hold the whole tragedy together. A quiet man, standing at the center of a curse he spent his last moments trying to soften. Here's something genuinely fascinating about Mikoto Uchiha. She sits at the softer edge of a clan defined by war, and yet almost everything the story shows us about her points to a version of the Uchiha that we never really got to see. Because Mikoto was the mother of Itachi and Sasuke, and she is one of the very few members of the clan ever presented living an ordinary, loving family life. Not a life measured in battles won or enemies buried, but a life of quiet rooms, shared meals, and small domestic moments. That alone makes her unusual. Everyone around her seems shaped by conflict, but Mikoto is shaped by home. So the question becomes, why did Kishimoto choose to hold her there, in the gentlest corner of the story, when almost every other Uchiha is defined by their fighting? The answer starts with something unexpected. Before the clan's fall, Mikoto was close friends with Kushina Uzumaki, Naruto's mother. And once you notice that connection, it quietly changes the shape of the whole series. Because these are the two most tragic families in Naruto, the Uzumaki and the Uchiha. And for a brief window, they were simply two women who knew each other, who talked, who shared the ordinary weight of being kunoichi and mothers at the same time. It's the kind of link that suggests a warmer, more connected world beneath the surface, a version of Konoha where these families weren't yet separated by loss. But that world only exists in fragments. We see the friendship, then the story pulls it away before it can grow into anything larger. And that's the thing about Mikoto. She was far more than the soft image she's remembered by. She was a talented kunoichi in her own right, genuinely skilled among the shinobi of her generation, which means she carried real ability, real capability, the same trained background that defined so many shinobi of her time. So there was clearly a warrior's story available here. There was a version of Mikoto the fighter, the capable kunoichi, the skilled clanswoman. But the narrative deliberately set that aside. Instead of showing us her battles, it chose to show us her kindness. It kept her in the kitchen, in the doorway, in the quiet reassurance she gave her sons. Her strength was made into background, and her gentleness was made into focus. And that choice was not an accident, because Kishimoto used her warmth as a tool. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. The reason the story lingers on Mikoto's kindness rather than her skill is that her gentleness is what makes the coming massacre land so hard. The audience needs to see the Uchiha as a real family before they lose everything. If we only knew them as proud warriors, as a clan of sharp eyes and sharper ambitions, their fall would feel like politics. But when we see Mikoto welcoming her children, when we see an ordinary mother in an ordinary home, the tragedy stops being about a clan and becomes about a family. So the softness isn't a smaller version of her character. It's the whole point. It's the emotional weight the story was quietly building the entire time. Which brings us to the night everything ends. Like Fugaku, Mikoto met her death calmly at Itachi's hands. There's no struggle, no desperate plea, no attempt to fight the son she raised. And remember, this was a woman who was a capable kunoichi in her own right, who understood exactly what shinobi life could demand. She could have resisted. Instead, she chose quiet acceptance. That stillness is one of the most haunting details in Itachi's entire life, because it means his parents did not die as enemies. They died understanding him and forgiving him in the same breath. So the warmth the story built around Mikoto doesn't disappear in that moment. It becomes the exact thing that follows Itachi for the rest of his short life. The gentleness he lost is the gentleness he can never stop carrying.
And there's one last detail, small but deliberate, that keeps her present long after she's gone. Mikoto's design gave Sasuke his softer features. The youngest survivor of the clan carries his mother's face more than his father's, a subtle visual thread tying him back to the gentlest member of the Uchiha. So even as Sasuke grows into anger, into revenge, into everything the curse of hatred represents, he physically resembles the one person in the story who embodied the opposite. It's a quiet piece of irony written into his very appearance.
So when you step back, Mikoto becomes a kind of shadow of a story that never got told. There was a skilled kunoichi here, a friend of Kushina, a woman with a whole life of experience behind her, and the narrative chose, almost entirely, to show us only her warmth. Not because the rest didn't exist, but because that warmth was the version the tragedy needed. She's the alternative Uchiha we glimpse but never fully meet. Proof that beneath the clan's reputation for pride and war, there was always the possibility of an ordinary, loving family. A possibility the story shows us just long enough to make its loss unforgettable. There's something most people don't know about Izuna Uchiha, and it's the kind of detail that quietly reshapes how you understand the entire clan. Because Izuna wasn't a footnote, and he wasn't a lesser shadow standing behind a more famous brother. He was Madara's younger sibling, yes, but in the earliest days of the Uchiha, when the clan was still a wandering group of warriors rather than a village institution, Izuna was considered nearly Madara's equal. Not close, not promising, nearly equal, in skill, in talent, and in raw power. And when you remember just how monstrous Madara would later become in the eyes of the world, that comparison starts to feel almost impossible. Two brothers, both prodigies, both burning with the same fire. That was the foundation the story was quietly built on. But talent in the Uchiha never came for free. Both brothers awakened the Mangekyo Sharingan, the clan's rarest and most feared evolution of the eye. On the surface, this looked like the greatest gift a warrior could receive. Beneath it, though, there was a hidden price, and it was a cruel one. The more they used that power, the more their eyesight faded. The very weapon that made them extraordinary was slowly, deliberately taking their vision away. So the strongest members of the clan faced a strange and quiet horror. The closer they came to their full potential, the closer they came to living in darkness. It was a flaw built right into the heart of the Uchiha's greatest strength, as if the eye itself demanded something in return. And this is where Izuna's story turns into something the whole saga would echo for generations. Because as Madara pushed his power further and further, his sight began to slip away, and the man who had helped lead his clan into an age of war was drifting toward blindness. Izuna, watching his brother fade, made a decision that most people would find unthinkable. To save Madara, he gave up his own eyes. He offered them to his brother directly. And when Madara accepted them, something entirely new was born. The first eternal Mangekyo Sharingan. A version of the power that no longer decayed, no longer stole the light, because it had been fused from the eyes of two siblings who shared the same blood. The endless curse of going blind was finally broken, but it was broken by loss. That single act is the reason an entire grim practice exists in this world. The transplanting of Uchiha eyes, one family member's sight given, taken, or inherited by another, doesn't begin as some cold experiment. It begins here, as a brother's sacrifice. And once that door was opened, it never closed. The same idea would ripple down the generations, all the way to Itachi giving his power to Sasuke, to Obito's eye passing through hands it was never meant to reach. Every one of those moments traces back to Izuna, to the quiet precedent he set long before any of those characters were even born. But what's really surprising comes next. Because the origins of Izuna aren't as fixed as you might expect. When you look across the different sources, the manga, the supplementary databooks, the later material that expanded the lore, the accounts of the two brothers don't perfectly line up. Kishimoto, the creator, quietly revised parts of Izuna's fate as the story deepened over the years. Details around exactly how he died and the precise circumstances of the eye transplant shifted depending on when and where the tale was told. And there's something strangely fitting about that. The Uchiha are a clan obsessed with memory, with grievance, with a past that refuses to stay buried. And yet even their own history was rewritten as the world around them grew larger. The origin of their greatest technique was, in a sense, edited after the fact. So the man at the very root of that legacy became a little blurred, a little uncertain, remembered slightly differently by every source that tried to hold on to him. And when you sit with all of it, a quiet theme starts to emerge, one that defines the Uchiha more than any battle ever could. Because of Izuna, the clan's power came to be measured not by what you gained, but by what you were willing to lose. The eternal Mangekyo Sharingan couldn't simply be earned through training or discipline. It demanded something precious, and almost always that something was family. A brother's eyes, a friend's death, a bond severed so that strength could rise from the wound.
The Uchiha didn't grow powerful in spite of their tragedies. They grew powerful through them. And the pattern started with two brothers and a single, irreversible gift. So when the clan's later history unfolds, all the betrayals, all the sacrifices, all the eyes passed from one generation to the next, none of it comes out of nowhere. It's all following a shape that Izuna carved first, in silence, without ceremony. He gave up his sight so his brother could keep his own, and in doing so, he wrote the rule the entire clan would live and die by. Sometimes the most important figures in a story are the ones we barely see. What very few people realize is that Danzo Shimura wasn't an Uchiha at all. He carried none of their blood, none of their bloodline, none of the crimson eyes that defined them. And yet, when you trace the destruction of the entire clan back to its source, no single person is more responsible than this quiet, bandaged old man who spent his life in the shadows of the hidden leaf. He wasn't a warrior standing on the battlefield. He was the architect working behind the curtain, the mind that engineered the massacre while everyone else was looking somewhere else. To understand how that happened, you have to understand what Danzo believed. He was convinced, deep in his bones, that the Uchiha clan was preparing to rebel against Konoha. Whether that fear was fully justified or wildly exaggerated is a question the story leaves deliberately open. But Danzo didn't wait to find out. He decided the threat had to be removed before it could ever become real. So he found the one person capable of doing it, a gifted young Uchiha named Itachi, and he manipulated him into an impossible bargain. Itachi would wipe out his own family, his own clan, everyone he had grown up with, and in exchange, Danzo would spare the life of Itachi's younger brother, Sasuke. It was blackmail dressed up as mercy, a choice that was really no choice at all. And here is where the story turns from tragic to genuinely disturbing. Because for most villains, the crime would end with the deed itself. For Danzo, the massacre was only the beginning. After the Uchiha lay dead, he didn't simply walk away. He harvested their Sharingan, the very eyes that made the clan feared across the ninja world. And he didn't take just one or two as trophies. He grafted 10 of them onto his own right arm, a grotesque row of stolen eyes embedded into his flesh, each one a weapon he could call upon in battle.
the clan he helped destroy became, quite literally, a part of his body. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because Danzo went one step further, and that step reveals something about the entire political machine of the village. Among the eyes he collected was the Sharingan of Shisui Uchiha, a shinobi whose eye held a power unlike any other. Shisui's Sharingan could cast a genjutsu so subtle, so complete, that it could control a person's mind without them ever knowing they'd been touched. The victim would believe every decision was their own. Danzo implanted that single eye into his own skull, hidden beneath the bandages he always wore, and he used it as a quiet instrument of influence over the village's leadership. He could nudge decisions, shift votes, steer policy, all while appearing to be nothing more than an aging advisor offering his counsel. The most powerful tool of manipulation in the entire village was sitting inside the head of the man who claimed to be protecting it. Now, if you step back and look at what Kishimoto was actually building here, you start to see why Danzo is such an unusual character. On the surface, the Uchiha clan is often remembered as the clan of villains, the source of so much of the series' darkness. But Danzo complicates that reading in a way that's almost uncomfortable, because the man who orchestrated their downfall wasn't an enemy of the village. He was one of its most loyal servants. He believed everything he did was in Konoha's best interest, and that turns him into a walking symbol of the village's relationship with the Uchiha, a relationship built on fear on one side and exploitation on the other. Konoha feared the clan's power, so it destroyed the clan. But then it kept that power, wore it, used it. Danzo carried 10 Uchiha eyes on his arm and 1 in his skull. The village didn't just eliminate the Uchiha. It stripped them of everything they were and put it on like stolen jewelry. That's the detail that makes Danzo so important from a storytelling perspective. Kishimoto could have written the Uchiha tragedy as a simple tale of dangerous ninjas who had to be stopped. Instead, he used Danzo to blur the line between villain and hero until it almost disappears. The clan's destruction wasn't really about evil at all. It was about political paranoia, about a leadership so afraid of a threat that it committed a far greater crime to prevent it. The Uchiha weren't destroyed because they were monsters. They were destroyed because powerful people were afraid of what they might become. And that fear was allowed to act without restraint. It's a remarkably bleak idea to place at the center of a story aimed at young readers, and yet that's exactly what gives the Naruto world its weight. The most terrifying figure in the Uchiha tragedy isn't a demon or a god. It's a tired old man who was certain he was doing the right thing, and through him, Kishimoto quietly asks the question that hangs over the whole clan's history. When a village will destroy an entire family out of fear, and then wear their eyes as its own, who exactly is the monster in that story? The story of Hashirama Senju begins not with a hero, but with a record that almost nobody stops to appreciate. He was the very first Hokage, the man whose face was carved first into the mountain above the village, and the leader of the Senju clan. And the Senju were not just any clan. For generations, across an unbroken chain of wars, they had been the Uchiha's oldest and most bitter rivals. If you measured the Uchiha's history in bloodshed, almost every major line in that ledger was written against a Senju name. So when you meet Hashirama, you meet the single figure who should, by every rule of that history, be the Uchiha's greatest enemy. But here is the detail that quietly breaks the pattern. Before either of them carried the weight of a clan, before the titles and the statues, Hashirama Senju and Madara Uchiha were children. two boys who met by a river, skipping stones, not knowing each other's family names. They became best friends. And what they shared was not a rivalry at all, but a dream. Both of them had watched younger brothers and companions die in these endless clan wars, and both of them wanted the same impossible thing. They wanted the fighting to stop. Two boys, from the two families most defined by hatred, sitting by the water, deciding that the killing had to end with their generation. So think about what that means for the village itself. Konoha, the Hidden Leaf, one of the most powerful ninja villages ever founded, does not exist because of a conquest or a treaty between armies. It exists because a Senju and an Uchiha decided, personally, to stop trying to kill each other. Hashirama extended his hand. Madara eventually took it, and their two clans laid down their weapons and built something together. The Leaf Village is, at its foundation, a friendship made into stone and streets. That is an extraordinary origin, and it is easy to forget when you only see the war that came after. And that war is where Kishimoto did something deliberate. He built the entire Uchiha tragedy around this one broken bond. The clan's long slide into isolation and suspicion did not begin with some ancient curse arriving out of nowhere. It began the moment Madara came to believe that Hashirama had betrayed their shared dream. In Madara's eyes, the peace they built quietly tilted in the Senju's favor, and the Uchiha were slowly pushed to the edges of the very village they had helped create. So the founding friendship and the founding wound are the same event, seen from two sides. The leaf was born, and the Uchiha's alienation was born in the same handshake. Yet, the most unexpected part is still to come. Because underneath the politics and the friendship, there was raw power, and the numbers there were never even. Hashirama's wood style was in a league of its own. He could grow forests out of bare earth, raise wooden structures the size of buildings, and suppress the strength of tailed beasts with a technique almost no one else in history could perform. It was a power the Uchiha, for all their fabled eyes, simply could not match. And that imbalance mattered. It was not just a matter of one strong man. It became a quiet, generational resentment. The sense that no matter how gifted an Uchiha was, there was a ceiling above them that a Senju had already broken through. That single gap in strength helped define the clan's mood for decades. So the resentment fed on itself, and the story could have ended there, with two rivals buried and their village moving on. But it did not end, and this is the record that ties everything together. Even after Hashirama's death, his body did not stop shaping the story. His cells, his DNA, that unique wood-style ability, became one of the most sought-after resources in the entire world. Scientists experimented with them. Madara himself, in secret, took Hashirama's cells and grafted them into his own body, using the power of his old friend to extend his life and unlock techniques far beyond a normal shinobi. So the two rival bloodlines, Senju and Uchiha, ended up literally fused inside a single person. The friendship that founded the village and the hatred that haunted it were, in the end, carried in the same flesh. And that is the quiet irony sitting at the center of it all. These two clans spent generations insisting they were opposites, the calm forest and the burning fire. But their fates were braided together far more tightly than either of them ever intended.
Every scheme that reached for immortality, every plan that tried to reshape the world, kept circling back to Hashirama's body, to that Senju power the Uchiha could never produce on their own. The rivalry never really separated them. It only bound them closer. So when you look back at the Uchiha's long, sad history, remember that its opening chapter was not a battle. It was a friendship by a river,
between the strongest Senju and the strongest Uchiha, who both wanted peace and got, instead, a village that would one day struggle to hold their descendants together. Behind the familiar appearance of Kagami Uchiha, there's a quiet contradiction, one that gently unravels almost everything people assume about his clan. Because if you've spent any time with the story of the Uchiha, you've probably absorbed a single, heavy idea: that they were doomed, that the blood itself carried something dark, a curse of hatred passed down like an inheritance no one could refuse. It's a tidy explanation. It's also, if you look closely at characters like Kagami, not quite true. Kagami lived in the earliest days of Konoha, back when the village was still young and still fragile. That friendship by the river, the one between the strongest Senju and the strongest Uchiha, had become a settlement, then a system, then a place where thousands of people had to learn to trust each other. And into that uncertain world stepped Kagami, a shinobi who, by every reputation his clan carried, should have grown resentful. But he didn't. And understanding why is where his story becomes genuinely surprising. Here's the setup. Kagami served on a team led by Tobirama Senju, the second Hokage. Now, Tobirama is a complicated figure in this history. He's often remembered, fairly or not, as the man whose suspicion helped push the Uchiha toward the edges of the village. He established institutions that would later be used to watch them. He spoke of the clan in ways that sound cold to modern ears. So picture the tension here. A young Uchiha placed directly under the command of the very man most associated with distrusting Uchiha. You'd expect friction. You'd expect the seed of exactly the bitterness the clan is famous for. And yet Kagami became one of Tobirama's most loyal students. He devoted himself to the village. He protected it without resentment, without the grudge you might assume was inevitable. The resolution to that tension is almost quietly radical. The clan's most infamous trait, hatred nursed into ruin, simply didn't take root in him. He chose the village. He kept choosing it. That choice matters more than it first appears, because Kagami wasn't a minor bystander. He stood among the elite shinobi of his generation. He was part of the group that would go on to shape Konoha's leadership for decades, alongside figures like Hiruzen Sarutobi, the boy who would become the third Hokage, and Danzo Shimura, and Homura and Koharu. These were the people who inherited the village from its founders, and an Uchiha stood right there among them, trusted, respected, integral. Not an outcast, not a threat, a pillar. But here's something many fans love to point to. Kagami's loyalty may not be the end of his significance in the larger story. Follow one popular theory forward, and you find something poignant. Many fans believe Kagami Uchiha was the grandfather of Shisui Uchiha. And if that name lands with a certain weight, it should. Because Shisui would grow up to be, in many ways, the emotional heir to everything Kagami represented. Shisui loved the village so deeply that he was called Shisui of the Body Flicker, a prodigy who believed, right up until his final moments, that the Uchiha and Konoha could still be saved together. He would ultimately give his own eye, and then his life, trying to prevent the very tragedy that hung over the clan. So look at what that connection, if the theory holds, would actually form. On one end, Kagami, a devoted protector in the village's cooperative dawn. On the other, Shisui, a devoted protector in the village's darkest hour. A thread running directly from the clan's hopeful past to its tragic future. And running through both men is the same stubborn, gentle refusal to become what the world expected an Uchiha to become. Whether by blood or by echo, it feels like more than coincidence. Because this is the deeper reason Kagami exists in the story at all. He appears only briefly,
mostly in flashbacks, easy to miss, easy to forget. But his role is precise. Every time he shows up, calm and loyal at Tobirama's side, he's quietly making an argument. He's evidence against the idea that the Uchiha were biologically destined for ruin. If the curse of hatred were truly baked into their blood, an inescapable fate, then Kagami couldn't exist. And yet there he is, proof that plenty of Uchiha chose loyalty over resentment, generation after generation, which flips the whole tragedy on its head.
The massacre that eventually befalls the clan, so often framed as the grim fulfillment of an ancient curse, starts to look like something else entirely. Not destiny, not blood. A political failure. A breakdown of trust between people who might have chosen differently, who had chosen differently before. The Uchiha weren't undone by their nature. They were undone by distrust, by fear, by decisions made in council rooms rather than something written into their veins. And that's the quiet weight Kagami carries. A character with almost no lines, standing at the very origin of the village, showing us that the ending was never inevitable. The friendship by the river could have held. Men like Kagami spent their whole lives proving it could. Which makes what came after not a curse fulfilled, but a promise broken, slowly, by people who forgot that an Uchiha, given the chance, would guard this village with everything he had. If you look closely at Tobirama Senju, you'll notice something that most people miss on their first pass through the story. He was the second Hokage, the younger brother of Hashirama, and by almost every measure, one of the most gifted shinobi the village ever produced. He built systems. He wrote doctrine. He designed the very structure of the Hidden Leaf as an institution, rather than a loose alliance of clans. But for all his brilliance, Tobirama carried a suspicion he never quite set down, and that suspicion was aimed squarely at the Uchiha. He said it openly. He believed the Uchiha were shackled by a special kind of chakra, one tied to unusually strong love. And when that love was broken, when they lost someone precious, that same chakra was said to twist into something far darker, into an overwhelming, consuming hatred. He called it, in effect, a curse. And because he said it plainly, in front of others, it began to sound like an established fact about an entire clan. Here's the counterintuitive part, though, and it's the kind of detail that changes how you read everything else. This idea of a curse of hatred was never actually presented as a hard biological rule. It wasn't a superpower switch buried in Uchiha DNA. It was closer to a narrative theory, a lens Kishimoto used to explain the recurring tragedy of the clan, rather than a mechanism that could be measured. The Uchiha felt more intensely. That part was consistent. But whether that feeling doomed them, or whether people simply expected it to, is a question the story leaves deliberately open. And that ambiguity matters, because Tobirama treated a theory as if it were a verdict. So he acted on it. Fearing that instability, that possibility of a good man turning after a single loss, he made a decision that would echo for generations. He created the Konoha military police force, and he placed the Uchiha clan directly in charge of it. On the surface, this looked like an honor. Policing the entire village, upholding its laws, holding real authority over daily order. If you didn't know the man's reasoning, you'd read it as a mark of deep trust. But it wasn't trust. It was containment dressed up as recognition. By handing them the police, Tobirama gave the Uchiha a role that sounded prestigious, but quietly walled them off from the places where actual power lived. They enforced decisions. They did not make them. They watched the village but drifted further from its heart,
from the council rooms and the leadership seats where the future of the Leaf was decided. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because the placement wasn't random cruelty, and it wasn't even conscious malice. It was a man trying to be responsible. Tobirama genuinely thought he was managing a risk, protecting the village he loved from a danger he was certain he'd identified. He believed he was being careful. So the tragedy isn't that a villain plotted against the Uchiha. The tragedy is that a thoughtful leader, acting on a fear he never questioned, built the exact structure that would isolate them. That structure sat there for decades, quiet and functional, until the resentment it created finally surfaced. The Uchiha found themselves relocated to the edge of the village, given duties but denied influence, respected in title but distrusted in practice. Generation after generation absorbed that message, that they were watched, that they were suspected, that no matter what they gave, they would always be held at arm's length. And that slow, accumulating frustration became the soil in which the clan's darkest chapter would eventually take root. So you can trace a straight line. One leader's suspicion, planted early, shaped the entire downfall of the Uchiha. Not through a single dramatic betrayal, but through a policy that seemed reasonable at the time and never got corrected. The curse of hatred, if it existed at all, wasn't something the Uchiha were born carrying. It was something the village kept reminding them they might have, until enough of them believed it. And here's the irony that ties it all together. Tobirama himself pioneered many of the very techniques the Uchiha would later be famous for rivaling. He was a master of space-time ninjutsu, the creator of the Flying Thunder God technique, the founder of shadow clone theory, a sensor of extraordinary range. He was, in his own way, exactly the kind of once-in-a-generation talent the Uchiha produced. He rivaled them, and yet he feared them, and he never seemed to notice how similar that made them. That's why his bias became one of the clearest lessons in the entire story. Not a lesson about Kekkei Genkai or forbidden jutsu, but about prejudice and how it works. He feared the Uchiha would become the village's enemy, so he treated them as a threat to be managed. And in treating them that way, in isolating them, in reminding them for decades that they were suspect, he helped create the very hostility he was trying to prevent. The fear didn't predict the outcome. The fear built it. And that's the quiet, uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of everything that came next.
People rarely talk about Uchiha Itachi as a doorway into the deeper history of his clan, but that's exactly what he is. To understand him, you have to understand the name he carried, because that name was never just a label. It was a clue. The word Uchiha is derived from Uchiwa, the paper fan used across Japan for centuries to fan open flames and coax a fire into life. So the clan's crest, that red and white fan you see stitched onto the back of Itachi's collar, isn't decoration at all. It's a statement of identity, a quiet declaration that this family and fire have always belonged to each other. And once you know that, a lot of small details start to make sense. The Uchiha are masters of fire release, so their most important childhood ritual is tied directly to flame. When a young Uchiha learns the Great Fireball technique, it isn't just another lesson. It's a rite of passage, a moment that marks a child as a true member of the clan. Itachi passed that threshold impossibly early, and Sasuke spent years chasing the same milestone, desperate to prove he belonged to the same bloodline. The fan on their backs was a promise, and the fireball was how you kept it. But here's where the connection becomes unexpectedly elegant. That fan shape, red on top and white below, doesn't only point back to fire. Look at it again, and you start to see something else hiding in plain sight.
The red and white coloring, the rounded form, the sense of something poised to turn. All of it visually echoes the Sharingan itself, the red eye with its slowly spinning pattern. So the name, the emblem, and the power all fold into a single idea. The fan that stirs the flames, the fire the flames become, and the eye that watches it all burn are three expressions of the same thing. It's the kind of design where the more you notice, the more deliberate it feels. And it was deliberate, because when Masashi Kishimoto built this clan, he reached far outside the story you think you're watching. This is where the unexpected connection really opens up. Kishimoto rooted the Uchiha in Hindu and Buddhist mythology, designing them as spiritual descendants of Indra, the elder son in the ancient story of the Sage of Six Paths. Indra was gifted with powerful eyes and overwhelming talent, the ability to reshape a situation through sheer force. But that gift came with a cost, written into the very foundation of who they were. Because Indra's counterpart, the younger brother Ashura, became the ancestor of the Senju, and the two lines were built as opposites on purpose. The Senju inherited a deep, renewable life force, endless stamina, the quiet strength of a body that simply refuses to quit. The Uchiha inherited the eyes, the spiritual energy, the raw power, but a weaker vitality underneath it all. So from the moment this clan was conceived, they were a people carrying enormous strength on a foundation that was never quite built to hold it. And that single design choice explains almost everything that goes wrong for them, which is what makes it so quietly tragic. But what's really surprising comes next, because this weakness isn't just background lore. It's baked directly into how their signature techniques work. Look at what the Uchiha actually pay to use their greatest abilities. The Mangekyo Sharingan, the highest form of their eye, slowly steals the user's eyesight the more they use it, until the world dims into permanent darkness. That isn't a random drawback. It's Indra's inheritance made literal. Power drawn straight from vitality the clan was never given enough of. So the pattern repeats everywhere once you see it. Their most devastating jutsu trade the user's own blood, their chakra, their lifespan, or their vision for a few seconds of overwhelming force. The tragedy isn't something that happens to the Uchiha by bad luck. It's stitched into the mechanics of their gifts, a toll collected every single time they reach for their full strength. They were, in the most literal sense, designed to burn brightly and burn out. Which brings us back to Itachi, standing at the exact center of all of it. He carried the fan that fans the flames. He mastered the fire earlier than almost anyone. He awakened the eyes descended from Indra, and he paid their price in the most direct way imaginable, using techniques that ate his eyesight and drained a body that was already quietly failing him. Every layer of the clan's design, the name, the crest, the mythology, the built-in cost, converged in one person who understood exactly what he was and chose to spend himself completely anyway. So when you watch Itachi, you're not really watching a single character. You're watching the whole idea of the Uchiha compressed into one life. A family whose name means fire, whose emblem hides an eye, and whose power was always going to demand everything they had. He was the clan's design taken to its logical end, and understanding that turns almost everything he does from a mystery into something that feels, in a strange and quiet way, inevitable. Curiously enough, Uchiha Madara didn't emerge from nowhere. He was the endpoint of everything the clan had slowly become, and to understand him, you really have to understand the eye that defined them all. The Sharingan, the clan's iconic red eye, doesn't simply appear at birth.
It awakens through strong emotion, through moments of intense stress or loss or longing. And its name is more literal than most people realize. Sharingan translates roughly to copy wheel eye, and that name reflects exactly what it does. The eye can perceive movement with astonishing clarity, read the subtle shifts in an opponent's muscles, and then memorize and mimic almost any technique it sees. So the Uchiha weren't just powerful, they were adaptive, able to absorb the skills of everyone around them. But here's the cruel catch built into that gift. To unlock the more powerful form, the Mangekyo Sharingan, an Uchiha traditionally has to experience something terrible. Not training, not discipline. Trauma. Specifically, the trauma of losing someone they loved deeply. The strength was locked behind grief, and only grief could open it. And once you sit with that idea, the whole tragedy of the clan starts to make a quiet kind of sense. This is why the curse of hatred feels almost self-fulfilling, because pain literally powers the clan up. The story rewards suffering with strength. So the more an Uchiha loved, the more they had to lose, and the more they lost, the stronger and more dangerous they became. It's a design that turns affection into a liability and heartbreak into fuel. A clan that loved intensely was, by its very nature, a clan that suffered intensely, and that suffering was written directly into their power. Kishimoto didn't invent this imagery from thin air either. The little comma-shaped marks that spin inside the Sharingan, the tomoe, were based on the Japanese magatama. Those are ancient comma-shaped beads, real objects found in Shinto sacred treasures, some of them thousands of years old. They appear among the imperial regalia of Japan, tied to mythology and ritual and the divine. So when you look at the Sharingan, you're actually looking at a design rooted in genuine cultural history, borrowed from beads that Japanese people have treated as sacred for a very long time. It gives the eye a weight that goes beyond the story, grounding a fantasy power in something old and real. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the Mangekyo carries a cost that mirrors its cruelty. Using it too often doesn't leave the user untouched. Overusing the Mangekyo Sharingan gradually damages the eyes and eventually causes blindness. The very power born from loss slowly takes away sight itself. So the Uchiha faced an impossible bargain. The more they leaned on their strength, the closer they came to darkness, quite literally. And that built-in cost pushed them toward desperate solutions. Because if your own eyes are failing, what do? You look for new ones. This is what drove the Uchiha into transplanting eyes, taking the Mangekyo of another, often a sibling or someone close, to restore their sight and unlock an even greater power. It deepened the spiral. A clan already defined by love and loss now had a reason to turn that loss into something transactional, trading eyes, trading lives, sinking further into the same darkness that had shaped them from the start. So when you place Madara at the end of all this, he stops looking like an anomaly. He looks like a conclusion. He awakened his Sharingan young, sharpened it through conflict, and awakened the Mangekyo through his own grief and the losses he endured. When his own sight began to fail, he took his brother's eyes to keep going. Every step he took was a step the clan's design had already laid out for him. He simply walked it further than anyone else dared to. And that's the legacy worth sitting with. Madara didn't break the rules of the Uchiha. He followed them to their absolute limit. He inherited a bloodline where love became pain, pain became power, and power slowly consumed the one who wielded it. He accepted every part of that bargain and asked for more. The blindness, the transplanted eyes, the endless hunger for strength, all of it was already encoded in what it meant to be an Uchiha. His lasting impact on the story comes from that completeness. Later characters would inherit his eyes, his ambitions,
and his warnings. The choices he made rippled forward for generations, shaping conflicts long after he was gone. And the tragedy is that none of it required a villain in the ordinary sense. It only required someone willing to take the clan's own logic seriously, without flinching, without stopping. So the Sharingan, the copy wheel eye born from emotion, the Mangekyo unlocked by loss, the sacred beads spinning inside it, the creeping blindness, the desperate trade of eyes for sight. These weren't separate details. They were a single, quiet chain of cause and consequence. And Madara was simply where that chain finally came to rest, the clearest reflection of a clan that was, from the very beginning, quietly cursed by the things it loved most. Originally, Hikaku Uchiha was never meant to be a character you'd remember. He appears in only a handful of panels, standing quietly at Madara's side, a lieutenant with no grand destiny of his own. But here's the strange thing about him. In a story built around a small circle of legendary names, Hikaku is one of those small background figures that accidentally became meaningful. Not because of what he did, but because of what his mere existence revealed about the world around him. To understand why he matters, you have to go back long before Konoha ever existed. In those days, there was no leaf village, no Hokage, no peaceful streets lined with shops and academies. There was only the Warring States period, a time when the land was carved up by clans who sold their strength to the highest bidder. And among those clans, the Uchiha stood near the very top. They were, in effect, a mercenary family for hire, feared across the world as one of the strongest fighting bloodlines that had ever existed. Warlords paid enormous sums simply to have them on the battlefield, because an Uchiha in your ranks often meant the fight was already decided. But strength like that always breeds a rival, and the Uchiha's rival was the Senju. These two clans hated each other with a depth that's hard to describe. They didn't fight once or twice. They fought constantly, generation after generation, in a cycle of revenge so relentless that it consumed the children before they ever grew up. Boys were handed weapons and marched into battle, and many of them died young, sometimes before they reached adulthood. So the hatred was never really allowed to cool. Each dead child became a reason for the next war, and each war produced more dead children. It was a loop that fed itself. And this is where Hikaku becomes quietly important, because he belonged to that world. He was a trusted lieutenant of Madara Uchiha, a man positioned close to the very heart of the clan's leadership. When Kishimoto placed background figures like Hikaku into the story, he was doing something subtle. He was showing you that the Uchiha weren't just Madara and Sasuke and Itachi. There was an entire clan structure underneath, a network of officers, soldiers, and lieutenants, all of them real people with roles and loyalties. Hikaku is the glitch that reveals the machinery, the small crack that lets you see the whole architecture behind the main cast. He makes the clan feel less like a handful of heroes and more like a nation. Now, if you'd been alive during that endless war, you would have assumed that the Uchiha and Senju hatred could only end one way, with one clan destroying the other. But here's the unexpected part. The thing that finally ended the cycle wasn't victory. It was peace. The Uchiha and the Senju, these two mortal enemies who had spent generations killing each other's children, sat down and made an agreement. And out of that agreement, they built something together. They founded Konoha Gakure, the Hidden Leaf Village. So the village that becomes the heart of the entire story was, quite literally, constructed by two families who had every reason in the world to want each other dead. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come, because that peace was never as clean as it looked. When the two clans came together, they didn't come together as equals.
The Senju held the leadership. Hashirama Senju became the first Hokage. And the Uchiha, the clan that had once been feared as one of the strongest in the world, settled into the new village under someone else's authority. They agreed to it reluctantly, swallowing a great deal of pride to do so. And that reluctance mattered more than anyone realized at the time, because a compromise made in exhaustion doesn't erase the feeling underneath it. The Uchiha had ended the war, but they hadn't ended their sense that they'd been diminished. They had traded their independence for a seat that always felt slightly below the one they thought they deserved. And so the founding of Konoha, which looked like a happy ending, actually planted a very quiet seed of resentment. That seed would grow slowly, across years and generations, until it produced almost every betrayal that follows. The distrust of the Uchiha, their gradual isolation within the village, the tragedy that eventually consumed the entire clan. All of it can be traced back to that original compromise, to two enemies building a home together without ever fully becoming equals inside it. Which brings us back to Hikaku, standing there in the background, a lieutenant of Madara in the days before the peace. He never lived to see how deep that resentment would run, but he represents the world it came from. He's a reminder that behind the legendary duels and the famous names, there was an ordinary clan of soldiers who had simply grown tired of burying their children. And in choosing peace over pride, they created a village and a wound that would define everything that came after. The Uchiha didn't fall in a single moment. They fell the way they always did, one quiet compromise at a time. One often overlooked detail about Naka Uchiha is that the name doesn't belong to a person at all. It belongs to a shrine, a quiet, unremarkable building tucked away in the oldest part of the Uchiha compound. And that's the first small deception, because the most important object in the entire clan's history was hidden not in a fortress, not in a vault, but in a place so plain that most people would walk right past it. The Naka shrine looked like nothing. That was the point. Beneath its floor lay the clan's most guarded secret, the Uchiha stone tablet. To the ordinary eye, it was just carved stone, rows of symbols that meant nothing at all. But the tablet wasn't written for ordinary eyes. It was written for the Sharingan. Only an awakened Uchiha could read even the first layer of what was inscribed there, which meant the knowledge of the clan was locked behind the very bloodline that defined them. You couldn't simply study your way into the truth. You had to bleed for it, awaken for it, earn it through loss. But here's where it becomes strange. The tablet didn't say the same thing to everyone. Its message changed depending on how powerful your eyes were. A Sharingan user could read one portion, a fragment. Awaken the Mangekyo, and more of the text became visible, layers that had been invisible a moment before. And only with the Rinnegan, the legendary eyes at the very top of the Uchiha and Senju lineage, could the full message finally be understood. So the same stone told different stories to different people, not because the stone changed, but because the reader did. And that single design choice quietly poisoned everything. Because if you can only read part of the truth, you will fill in the rest yourself. Madara Uchiha read that tablet with eyes strong enough to see more than almost anyone before him, but not strong enough to see all of it. He walked away convinced he understood the message left behind by the sage of the six paths. He didn't. He'd read a partial truth and mistaken it for the whole. And that misreading pushed him, and later the entire war, toward a darker path built on a lie he genuinely believed was salvation. Now, here's what almost nobody notices. The way you entered this secret wasn't random. The entrance to the tablet's chamber was hidden beneath the 7th tatami mat of the shrine. Not the first, not the center, the 7th. And that number isn't decoration. In traditional Japanese architecture, tatami mats are never just flooring. Their count and arrangement carry ritual meaning, tied to ceremony, to death rites, to the sacred and the ordinary being kept carefully apart. Certain layouts are considered auspicious, others are reserved strictly for funerals and mourning. So the clan hid its holiest secret using the same quiet grammar that real Japanese homes and temples have used for centuries, a language of floors that most viewers never even register. That's the Easter egg buried in plain sight. The Uchiha didn't invent a fantasy vault. They borrowed from a real cultural practice, where the number and placement of mats could signal that a space was sacred or that death was near. Hiding the tablet under the seventh mat wasn't a story convenience. It was a nod to a tradition where the floor itself is a kind of code, readable only to those who know how to look. Fitting for a clan whose entire tragedy is about who is allowed to read what. But the deeper you go, the darker it gets. Because knowledge gated by eye power isn't neutral. It means the strongest Uchiha always held the final word on what the truth was. The weak read fragments, the powerful read more. And whoever awakened the rarest eyes could claim to have seen the complete message, and no one beneath them could argue, because no one beneath them could even read it. So the clan's own legends became a tool. Whoever controlled the interpretation controlled the direction of the entire bloodline. And that is the quiet horror of the Naka shrine. The Uchiha built their identity around a stone that promised the truth, then made that truth impossible to fully reach. It turned their history into something that could be shaped, edited, weaponized from within their most sacred place. A clan that prized clarity of vision above all else was undone by a message it could never quite see clearly. So when people say the Uchiha were cursed by hatred, that's only half the picture. They were also cursed by information, by a secret designed to reveal itself unevenly, feeding ambition to those already strong enough to be dangerous. The tablet didn't lie. It simply told incomplete truths to incomplete eyes, and left the rest to pride and imagination. The Naka shrine still stood, plain and silent, long after the misreadings had done their damage. A building most would ignore, hiding under its seventh mat a stone that helped bend an entire clan toward ruin, one carefully hidden layer of truth at a time. Here's something genuinely fascinating about Uchiha Teyaki. When Kishimoto first sketched out the Uchiha clan, most of the attention naturally went to the fighters, the sharp-eyed prodigies, the ones with names that echo through the whole story. But somewhere along the way, the idea took shape that not every Uchiha was a warrior at all. Some of them, like Teyaki, simply ran shops. And that quiet choice, easy to overlook, ended up carrying more weight than almost anything a battle scene could have shown. Teyaki owned a senbei store, a small shop selling those thin, roasted rice crackers tucked away in the Uchiha district of Konoha. Picture that for a moment. A man with the same bloodline said to be cursed by hatred, the same eyes tied to legends of war and vengeance, spending his days behind a counter, seasoning crackers, greeting customers, closing up at night. It's such an ordinary life that it almost feels like it belongs to a different version of the clan entirely, one that never made it to the front of the story. But here's where that small detail starts to matter. Because for Teyaki to have a shop, there had to be a place to put it. And that place was the Uchiha district, a walled-off neighborhood set apart from the rest of the village. This wasn't just a cluster of homes. It was a whole community, physically separated from Konoha proper, with its own streets, its own shops, its own rhythm of daily life. So the moment you learned Teyaki sold rice crackers, you also learned something bigger. The Uchiha didn't just live in the village. They lived beside it, behind a boundary. And that boundary was never meant to feel like a wall in the cruel sense. Officially, The separation was framed as a way to keep the Uchiha organized, to give the clan its own space, its own order. It sounds almost reasonable when you say it plainly. But intentions and outcomes don't always match. Because a neighborhood set apart for the sake of order slowly becomes a neighborhood set apart, full stop. So the very people who had helped found Konoha, who had bled for it in its earliest days, began to feel like guests in a home they'd built with their own hands. That's the heartbreaking turn hiding inside a rice cracker shop. The segregation meant to keep the Uchiha tidy and manageable ended up making them feel like outsiders in their own village. And once a group of people starts to feel like outsiders, distrust has a way of growing in both directions. The village watched the district more closely. The district felt the watching. And the gap widened, quietly, year after year, without a single blow being struck. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because when the tragedy finally came, that district full of ordinary lives didn't get spared for being ordinary. Teyaki and his wife, Uruchi, were civilians. They had no part in any coup, no seat at any secret meeting, no hand in the plot that would eventually seal the clan's fate. They were, as far as we're ever shown, a couple who ran a shop and lived a small, honest life. But on the night of the massacre, that made no difference at all. They were killed the same night as the clan's fighters, alongside everyone else behind those walls. Think about what that choice does to the whole story. If the massacre had only claimed warriors, it would read as a grim clash between shinobi, tragic but almost expected in a world built on conflict. But it didn't stop at warriors. It reached the shopkeepers, the elders, the families with no stake in any conspiracy. So the event stops being a battle and becomes something much heavier. It becomes the death of a community. And that, in the end, is exactly why Teyaki exists. Kishimoto could have kept the Uchiha as a clan of fighters and nothing more. That would have been the simpler version, the one that never needed a rice cracker shop. But by adding these small, everyday characters, people with trades and storefronts and quiet routines, he made sure the massacre would land differently. You weren't just losing a group of ninja. You were losing neighbors. You were losing a place where someone sold crackers on the corner, where an old couple opened their doors each morning. So a character who never fights, never unlocks some legendary power, never speaks more than a few lines, ends up doing something none of the warriors could. He makes the loss feel human. He turns an abstract tragedy into a specific one, the kind you can almost picture. An empty shop, a cold oven, a district gone silent. It's a strange thing to sit with. The Uchiha are remembered for their eyes, their strength, their long shadow over the whole saga. But maybe the truest measure of what was lost isn't found in the fighters at all. Maybe it's found in a man like Teyaki, who only ever wanted to run his little store in a walled-off corner of a village that never quite let him feel at home. And in the quiet after that night, his empty shelves say more than any battle ever could. Tonight we drifted through the whole Naruto world, tracing the Uchiha and their bloodline cursed by hatred, all the way down to the quiet corner where Teyaki Uchiha once lived. Thank you for wandering these stories with me, as sleep settles softly over you now. And now, let these tales carry you gently into the dark. Sweet dreams.